You're watching Newsday on the BBC. I'm Sharonjit Lail in Singapore. The headlines. President Trump says he's been advised not to listen to an audio recording of the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi because it's too violent and terrible to listen to.
It's a suffering tape. It's a terrible tape. I've been fully briefed on it. There's no reason for me to hear it. In fact, I said to the people, should I? They said, you really shouldn't.
California's wildfires, how the emergency services are coping with the crisis with more than 1,000 people still missing.
I'm Kesha Madeira in London, also in the programme. The British Prime Minister speaks of a crucial few days ahead for her Brexit plan, saying replacing her as leader wouldn't make negotiations any easier. And the story of the South Korean soldier rowing his way to sporting success after he stepped on a mine on the border with the North.
Live from our studios in Singapore and London. This is BBC World News. It's Newsday.
Good morning. It's 9 a.m. here in Singapore, 1 in the morning in London and 8 p.m. in Washington, where President Trump says he's been fully briefed on an audio recording of the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The president also said he expects a report on who was responsible for the killing to be completed by Tuesday. The CIA is reported to have concluded that the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman ordered the killing, but Mr. Trump said those reports are premature. Let's hear what President Trump had to say.
We have the tape. I don't want to hear the tape. No reason for me to hear the tape.
Why don't you want to hear it, sir?
Because it's a suffering tape. It's a terrible tape. I've been fully briefed on it. There's no reason for me to hear it. In fact, I said to the people, should I? They said, you really shouldn't. There's no reason. I know everything that went on in the tape without having to.
And what happened?
It was very violent, very vicious, and terrible.
A month ago, you said you had spoken with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and that he had told you directly that he had no knowledge of this.
That's right. And still says that.
Well, our Washington correspondent Chris Buckler has all the latest.
President Trump insists that the CIA assessment has not been completed. He does, however, expect it to be complete by Tuesday. And at this stage, he says it is premature and inaccurate to suggest that the intelligence agency has concluded that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman ordered the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. There's also been a very carefully worded statement by the State Department over the weekend in which they say that the US government, perhaps distinct from the CIA, has not yet reached any final conclusions. There has, of course, also been that very firm denial from Saudi Arabia. But there continue to be these questions, and the CIA has certainly been looking at evidence, which includes that tape of the killing inside the Istanbul consulate, that audio recording that President Trump has so far avoided hearing. And beyond that, there is also apparently some suggestions that they have phone calls, one of which was made by some of those involved in the killing from the consulate, apparently to a top aide of the Crown Prince. But when you look at these reports from the CIA's assessment, all these newspaper reports are suggesting that none of them have particularly concrete evidence, no standalone evidence that shows definitively that the Crown Prince was involved. Essentially, no smoking gun. And that is something that President Trump may well talk about in the future, particularly as Congress pushes for more action against Saudi Arabia. And that is certainly coming. At the moment, he is emphasising the relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia and how important it is. Even this weekend, he described them as a spectacular ally in terms of jobs and economic investment. It gives you this real sense that the White House and President Trump at this stage don't want to hear certain things. And that goes beyond just this tape of the killing of a journalist inside a Saudi consulate.
Chris Buckler reporting from Washington. Now let's bring you up to date with some of the day's other news stories. The European Commission has proposed that the post-Brexit transition period could be extended until 2022. That is 2 years beyond the date originally indicated, and this could really cause more problems for the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, from Brexit supporters in her government. Earlier, Mrs May warned party colleagues opposed to her Brexit deal that changing leaders now risks frustrating Brexit altogether.
These next 7 days are going to be critical. They are about the future of this country. It's about people's jobs, it's about their livelihoods, it's about the future for their children and grandchildren. I'll be going back to Brussels. We will be negotiating.
So when are you going back to Brussels?
Well, the negotiating teams are working as we speak, and obviously which day I go back to Brussels, when I go back, will determine partly be about how those negotiations go. So I will be going back to Brussels. I'll be in touch with other leaders as well, because the summit next week, and it is next week, this special European Council, will be among the European leaders.
Well, as we heard Theresa May say there, later this week she's expected to meet European leaders, including the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker. The BBC's Europe editor Katja Adler has more on what the two leaders will be focusing on in that meeting.
It's not supposed to be about reopening the divorce deal, that withdrawal agreement that was published last week, where, as we know, some prominent MPs are asking for a renegotiation. There really is no appetite in EU circles to fundamentally change that document. So the Prime Minister is planning to come this week to Brussels to discuss the second Brexit document that actually is still being negotiated. That political declaration, an outline by the EU and the UK as to how they imagine their future relationship will be after Brexit. Now, of course, remember, this is not anything like a final trade deal, but the Prime Minister needs it to look attractive enough economically and politically to help her sell that unpopular withdrawal agreement.
Katja Adler there on BBC in Brussels, and here across the BBC we'll be monitoring all the week's events, so do stay with us for all of that. Now let's take a look at what else is making the news. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has called on his coalition partners not to bring down their government, which was plunged into crisis by the resignation of the Israeli Defense Minister. He quit last week because he disapproved of a ceasefire agreed with militants in Gaza. The US Special Envoy to Afghanistan has said that he hopes to cement a peace deal with Taliban insurgents by next April. Zalmay Khalilzad said that he remained cautiously optimistic for the end to the 17-year conflict. Mr. Khalilzad has been leading the US efforts to convince the Taliban to negotiate with the Afghan government. A video has been released of an Argentine submarine which went missing a year ago with 44 crew members on board. The new footage shows the moment that a remotely operated vehicle discovered the sub lying on the sea floor. It is currently 907 metres below the ocean surface. At a ceremony in Germany to commemorate those who died in 2 world wars, President Macron has made an impassioned appeal for a stronger Europe. He said that too many powers sought to thwart Europe by attacking liberal democracies. Now let's bring you up to date with tennis news, because 21-year-old German tennis player Alexander Zverev has won the ATP finals in London. He beat the world #1 Novak Djokovic from Serbia in 2 sets. Absolutely thrilled. It's the best title, the biggest title of the German's fledgling career.
Now, emergency workers in California are still struggling to contain wildfires that have devastated large areas of the state over the last 10 days. At least 76 people are now known to have died, and authorities say more than 1,200 people are unaccounted for. President Trump has visited the devastated town of Paradise, one of the worst affected areas. Our correspondent Dan Johnson reports from there.
This is a ghost town that cannot lay its souls to rest.
I'll be out of the Paradise area for a detail.
So we're on Pence Road now, and this is where the brunt of the fire hit.
And those sworn to protect life and property here must now assess what's gone.
So we're going to go over to check on a property where an 88-year-old woman lived.
Sergeant Rob Nichols barely recognises streets he's patrolled for 18 years.
All the normal landmarks that you're used to using are gone.
There's a new daily drumbeat here, uncovering the agony of a fire that gave people little chance.
That was the aluminum wheel.
Yeah.
A lot of heat.
Piecing together its painful suffering.
So, pretty frail, probably not able to get out on her own. Probably didn't drive, And the fire hit kind of early in the morning, so who knows if she was even awake.
Deaths are confirmed, Their cruelty is clear.
I think I might have a name for you.
Oh, okay, sweet.
So it looks to me that that was the person we were searching for.
Right.
Okay.
So that means you've got some news to give.
I do.
The smoke, the smell, the popping power cables, the early signs of something awful. And in growing chaos, a handful of officers dedicated to keeping people safe.
The fire is getting closer, and people are just sitting in their cars stranded.
Duty came before family.
You know, my wife's hysterical. She wants me out. You know, she's begging me, get a helicopter, get out of there. I said, babe, I can't leave. I have 200 people here that I gotta take care of.
They survived, so did many others. Rob's wife and children are safe.
So we're coming up on my house on the left here.
But his home was destroyed like thousands of others. Would you be happy to come back and live here?
Yes, I would. Yeah. I love it up here, so I hope to be back.
They built paradise with hope and ambition. So much has gone, but not that. Dan Johnson, BBC News, Paradise.
Taiwan is gearing up for upcoming regional elections, along with a list of important referenda on issues ranging from nuclear power to same-sex marriages. Rallies for and against equal marital rights have been held throughout Taiwan at the weekend. Taiwan's president, whose election campaign included a promise of marriage equality, has been criticised by rights groups about the little progress made so far. Well, earlier I asked our correspondent Cindy Su in Taipei whether this vote will tell us if the ruling party's firm anti-Chinese stance has paid off.
Well, indeed, this will be an election not only about the mayors and magistrates of the 6 biggest cities and counties in Taiwan. It's also sort of a referendum on the current administration of President Tsai Ing-wen and the ruling party, DPP, which is pro-independence. This is a midterm election, so it's a chance for the voters to tell her and her party what they think of how they're doing. So what's up for election is the mayor's posts in 6 major cities in Taiwan. And currently the ruling party holds 4 of the cities. But the polls are showing that it could be a very close race, that they could lose at least one of those cities. So that could tip the balance because, as you probably know, the ruling party actually now holds not only the presidency, but also the parliament. So if they lose some of these major cities, that could give the opposition party, including the pro-China KMT, more influence in the next 2 years ahead of the 2020 presidential election.
And that was Cindy Su speaking to Kasha earlier. Well, you're watching Newsday on the BBC. Still to come on the programme, we hear from a South Korean soldier who's rowing his way to sporting success after losing both his legs in a landmine accident.
Also coming up on the programme, we're going to have Jumbo Care. India's first specialised hospital for elephants opens in Mathura.
Benazir Bhutto has claimed victory in Pakistan's general election, and she's asked Pakistan's president to name her as Prime Minister.
Jackson's been released on bail of $3 million after turning himself in to police in Santa Barbara.
It was the biggest demonstration so far of the fast-growing European anti-nuclear movement.
The South African government has announced that it's opening the country's remaining whites-only beaches to people of all races.
This will lead to a black majority government in this country and the destruction of the white civilization.
Part of the centuries-old Windsor Castle, one of the Queen's residences, has been consumed by fire for much of the day. 150 firemen have been battling the blaze, which has caused millions of pounds worth of damage.
Thanks for staying with us. You're watching Newsday on the BBC. I'm Sharon Jeet-Lail in Singapore.
And I'm Kasia Madeira in London. Our top stories this hour. President Trump has said that he has been briefed about an audio tape of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but says that he hasn't listened to it himself because it's so violent.
And emergency workers in California are still struggling to contain wildfires that have devastated parts of the state. At least 76 people have died and over 1,200 are still missing. Let's take a look now at some of the front pages from around the world. We can start with the Straits Times, which leads with the impasse at the annual APEC summit in Papua New Guinea. Well, the group failed to issue a communique for the very first time ever. Instead, a chairman's letter will be released. And we've got the Japan Times, which has a story on efforts to curb China's influence in the South Pacific. The paper says that Australian and New Zealand governments are teaming up with Japan and the US, all in response to growing investment from Beijing in that region. And finally, we've got the South China Morning Post, which reports on an erotic writer who's been sentenced to 10 years in jail in mainland China. Now, the writer, known by her internet alias Tian Yi, was sentenced for writing and selling a gay porn novel. The paper says the severity of the sentence was met with shock and outrage. And that brings you up to date with some of the papers. Kasia, what are some stories sparking discussions online?
Sharanjit, you've been talking about the newspapers. Well, an Australian magazine has really got people talking online. It's one of the country's leading wedding magazines, and it is shutting down following its refusal to feature same-sex couples. The founders of White magazine have posted a farewell message on their website, saying that their publication was no longer economically viable after several advertisers withdrew.
Now, East Asia has been gripped by an unprecedented rise in myopia, also known as short-sightedness. Now, 60 years ago, up to 20% of the Chinese population was short-sighted. Well, today, that's up to 90% of teenagers and young adults. Education and time spent indoors are to blame for the rising incidence in young people. 6 countries in Asia, including Singapore, have seen an increase of 2 to 3 times the number of young people suffering from myopia in just the last 30 years. Well, Ian Morgan of the Australian National University has been researching this and says the findings are very surprising.
Well, they're alarming because, first of all, any country with this sort of load of myopia has to be able to provide spectacle corrections for children. This is fine in a country like Singapore, which is a wealthy country, but if you think about mainland China, where they're faced with something like a future with 1 billion people who are myopic, they don't have the services and they don't have the income to properly guarantee corrections. Mm-hmm. When you add to that the fact that when you get severe myopia, you're at higher risk of quite serious eye complications, which can lead to visual impairment and blindness.
That's right. There's a lot of really data out there that suggests it will lead to blindness. About 1 billion potentially could go blind from this by 2050. But tell us, first of all, why are the rates here in Asia so high? How does it compare with the rest of the world?
Well, it's very much higher. The typical value for a European country in the same age group, young adults, would be 20 to 30% compared to 70, 80, 90% in East Asia. The prevalence of high myopia is even more spectacularly different. It's probably 1% in Western countries. It's 10 to 20% in this young adult population in East Asia.
And do we know what is it specifically to blame? Is it education? Is it genetics?
Well, yeah, a reasonable hypothesis at one stage was that it was genetics. But the epidemiology did not suggest that it was genetic, and more recent studies using genetic techniques suggest that equally that it's not genetic. What it seems to be due to is a combination of really intensive study regimes starting when children are quite young. And I mean, yeah, in East Asia we're talking about homework for preschool kids, something that's inconceivable in my country, for example. When you combine that with a lifestyle and a cultural attitude to being outdoors, which tends to favour indoor activities, and sometimes the climate reinforces that.
Okay.
Then you end up with intense education, a deficit of exposure to bright light, and you get these epidemic proportions of myopia.
Ian Morgan from the Australian National University speaking a little earlier to Sharon Jeet. Now, UN officials in Myanmar say that they are deeply concerned by reports of police shooting and injuring 4 Rohingyas in a displacement camp. The incident is said to have taken place 15 kilometres east of Sittwe in western Rakhine State. Officers were trying to detain suspects allegedly linked to a smuggling operation which saw more than 100 Rohingyas arrested on a boat last week. Let's get the very latest. Nick Beek joins us from Yangon in Myanmar. Nick, so we know that the 100 Rohingyas were trying to leave Myanmar. What do we know about this latest unrest?
Yeah, Kasia, there's not a huge amount of details about this latest incident yesterday, but as you say, over the past year we've heard so much about the Rohingya who have fled Rakhine State to the west of Myanmar because of the military operations there. They fled to Bangladesh, but many people have been in these displacement camps further south in Rakhine State for the past 6 years after a previous bout of violence. And what happened yesterday, it seems, is that police officers went into one of the camps, there was a disturbance, and at least 4 Rohingya people were shot and injured. We don't know their exact conditions, but real concern there, possibly because things could escalate in the coming days. And the reason the authorities had gone in is because they were trying to arrest 2 men who apparently owned a boat which was used to take some 106 Rohingyas from that part of Myanmar, and they were trying to get to Malaysia, but they apparently ran into trouble, and so these Rohingyas were arrested on the boat near Yangon, the city that I'm talking to you from now, the main city. And there's concern once again that people are trying to get on boats to flee the country because of the persecution they face.
Given that still Rohingya are trying to leave Myanmar, the Burmese want them to be repatriated, especially from the big camps in Bangladesh. Where are we with this whole situation? Because, of course, the rights that the Rohingya want are still not being granted to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And the UN says that it's simply not safe for any Rohingyas to come back to Myanmar at the moment because they don't have citizenship, they don't have free movement, they don't have access to healthcare, they don't have access to schools for the kids. So there's real concern there. And we've heard from Bangladesh actually in the last 12 hours saying that they will try and start up again this returns programme, taking people back to Myanmar. But the concern is, as you say, simply not safe for them to come back at the moment.
Nick Beek, many thanks for bringing that to us. Nick Beek there in Yangon.
Now, a charity has opened a hospital with a difference in northern India. As Daniel McCarroll explains, staff there have had to deal with some very large patients.
Healthcare in India made headlines this year. 2018 saw the launch of Modi Care, pitched as the world's largest health insurance plan. And now another first. A hospital devoted to the health of the country's largest mammal, the Indian elephant. There are roughly 25,000 in the wild, and hundreds are kept in captivity, mostly to attract tourists and perform religious rituals. They are often ill-treated and forced to obey instructions with a sharp metal hook. The Wildlife SOS Elephant Hospital has been built for the treatment of injured, sick, or geriatric elephants. It is now home to 22 patients, some as old as 67.
These elephants go through a lot of abuse, brutality, cruelty in order to be ridden. And through that process, they develop abscesses, internal problems, back problems, all kinds of health issues that need to be addressed.
The hospital boasts an array of modern facilities, including thermal imaging equipment, ultrasonography, and a wireless X-ray. It also offers a range of skin treatments, ranging from the modern to the more traditional.
I think by building a hospital, we are underlining the fact that elephants need welfare measures as much as any other animal, that captive elephants are not meant to be used and abused, but instead have to be given the respect which an animal needs if you're going to be using the animal.
The hospital has mobile equipment intended to treat elephants across northern India. It is built on the banks of the river Yamuna, next to an elephant conservation and care centre, where patients of all ages can relax and heal, and even enjoy the retirement we all look forward to in our winter years. Daniel McCarroll, BBC News.
Good to see those creatures being treated so well. You've been watching Newsday. I'm Kasia Madeira in London.
And I'm Sharonjit Lail in Singapore. Stay with us because we'll have all the reaction to the APEC summit in Papua New Guinea, which ended without any agreement for the first time in its history.
And Sharonjit, we're probably more used to seeing him on glitzy red carpets or glamorous Hollywood affairs, but this weekend Will Smith did something rather different. There he is. He ran a half marathon in Cuba's capital. The star, affectionately known as Big Willie, joined around 6,000 people racing through the streets of Havana. We're not sure what his time was, but he did finish, and he did tell reporters that he was pretty excited about the challenge. What a great guy. Good work for Will Smith there, running the marathon in Cuba. Bye-bye from all of us.
Hello there. This is the week where winter makes something of a comeback. The weather is set to get quite a bit colder, probably the coldest day Tuesday in the week ahead. Now, we've had clear skies over recent hours. That's allowed temperatures to plummet away. Northern Scotland, we've already seen temperatures down as low as -4 in Inverness and also in Braemar. But over the next few hours, cloud will be spreading in from the North Sea across much of Scotland, much of England and into eastern areas of Wales as well. That, combined with a breeze, should prevent a frost from many of us, but it will still be a chilly old start to the day. Now, the big change with Monday's weather compared with what we had over the weekend is there's going to be much more cloud in the sky. There'll still be occasional brighter spells, but through the afternoon, the cloud will thicken to bring showers. They'll come along in shower streams. One of those could well target Kent and Essex, another one running into parts of Norfolk and Lincolnshire. Now, running up the eastern coast, you'll notice the showers get a little bit less widespread as we work towards northeast England and eastern Scotland. So you'll be quite unlucky to see showers here. There will, though, be one or two knocking around. Temperatures, not as warm as the weekend. We're looking at highs typically into single figures, and the colder air will begin to move in as we head into Tuesday. The cloud thickens as well, so there'll be further showers around, perhaps a bit of winteriness mixed in too, particularly but not exclusively over the hills. Temperatures, well, we're looking at highs of around 5 degrees or so in places, but factor in these strong winds gusting to 40, maybe 50 miles an hour around the coast, and it will feel colder than these numbers would suggest. Not that 5's a particularly warm day, that's pretty cold for this time of the year, but if you add the wind onto that, it will feel more like freezing in places. And there could well be a bit of snow around Tuesday night, perhaps across the hills of Wales, also the Brecon Beacons as well. Now, the middle part of the week sees this big blocking pattern set up in the jet stream. That means the warmth from the Atlantic really won't be pushing in this week. Instead, the winds will be coming in from an east or southeasterly direction. So it's a slow recovery process with temperatures from Tuesday on into Wednesday. You notice the winds coming from a slightly more of a east-southeasterly direction, and that will push some of the thicker cloud and showers further northwards across northern England into Northern Ireland and Scotland. Bits of white mixed in. Yes, there could be a bit of snow over the hills. The Grampians could see some of that. Maybe the tops of the Northern Pennines and the North York Moors. But at the same time, the weather might become a little bit drier towards southeastern areas. Another cold day, mind you. Highs of between 7 and 8 degrees Celsius for most. That's your weather.
Now here's the science bit.
Ready.
Could a bendy phone be the future?
There really is no driver.
Oh, I feel better for that.
Click. Saturday and Sunday at 12:30 on the BBC News Channel.
Sometimes being in the driving seat is... She stayed in school. She's a... This isn't just playing sport. This is... the simple act of standing, and you're a... You don't need superpowers to change the world. 100 Women. A season of inspiring and challenging stories across the BBC.
I'm Kasia Madeira with BBC News. Our top story, President Trump says that he's been fully briefed on an audio recording of the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But he said that he would not listen to the tape, which he described as vicious and violent. Mr. Trump said that CIA reports that the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman must have ordered the killing were premature, and it may be impossible to ever know. Emergency workers in California are still struggling to contain wildfires that have devastated parts of the state over the last 10 days. At least 76 people have died. And this story is trending on BBC.com. A painting believed to be by Pablo Picasso has turned up in Romania 6 years after it was stolen from a Dutch museum. Harlequin Head was one of 7 masterpieces snatched from a museum in Rotterdam. That's all from me. Stay with us on BBC News. Our top story in the UK, the government's promising students in England the option of accelerated 2-year degree courses. Now let's cross over to Singapore for the latest business news live.
No deal. APEC members walk away without a statement over the US-China trade war. Board members of India's central bank will hold a crucial meeting later today after a clash with Narendra Modi's government over the RBI's autonomy. Hello and welcome to Asia Business Report. I'm Sharanjeet Lail. Now, the APEC summit in Papua New Guinea has ended without a joint communique for the first time in its history, and that's because of deep divisions on trade between the US and China. Now, at the meeting, Chinese President Xi Jinping criticized America's first policy and said countries that were protectionist were, quote, doomed to failure. Vice President Mike Pence, standing in for President Trump, criticized China's Belt and Road Initiative. And Mr. Pence said the US will help redevelop a naval base in Papua New Guinea, as well as spend $1.7 billion to build electricity infrastructure across the country. But China is also investing heavily in Papua New Guinea to win its hearts and minds. From Port Moresby, Karishma Vaswani reports.
A grand welcome for a new friend. Papua New Guinea rolled out the red carpet for China's President Xi Jinping in town for APEC and a state visit.
Thousands of people have gathered here just to catch a glimpse of the Chinese president. This boulevard that he's driving down, it's been paid for by Beijing. And it's the same thing across the country. 90% of the roads here are being built in some way or another with China's help. This is infrastructure Papua New Guinea really needs.
China hasn't been shy about showing off where it's spent its money. Roads, highways, convention centers, all bankrolled by Beijing. But the way it does business here, with little transparency, has also raised anti-Chinese sentiment.
It's a signal picking up.
But there are locals here who see China as a friend. Vani Nadas is the ambassador for the China-Papua New Guinea Friendship Association. Chinese businesses here pooled their money together to fund it.
When we need something, they're there to, help us. People seeing, Chinese people like they're coming into the country and getting everything that, Papua New Guinea owns. But that has to change. That perception has to change about, Chinese people here in PNG. They're here to help.
Australia has traditionally been Papua New Guinea's biggest donor and investor, but China's presence here is growing rapidly, and it's increasingly visible. Fears are growing as to what Beijing wants from this region.
You take a look at what China has done in Djibouti, what China is doing in Sri Lanka by taking ownership of a 99-year lease of a port that they themselves built, and you can draw the thread out to the Pacific. I think that is the great concern, is that they will get a foothold somewhere in the Pacific. They'll be opportunistic as to where that may be, and over time they'll slowly slice the salami to a point where, in 20, 30 years' time, we have a full-fledged military installation somewhere in the Pacific.
That's why this country is now so important to the US and its allies. America is investing in a new naval base, electricity and internet infrastructure here. The battle for influence between these two superpowers is benefiting Papua New Guinea for now, but it will also determine its direction in the future. Karishma Vaswani, BBC News, Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea.
So, how do smaller APEC nations choose between the world's 2 largest economies? Well, one of those countries is Chile. That's the host of the APEC summit next year in 2019. Earlier, I sat down with an exclusive interview with its president, Sebastián Piñera, and asked him how the US-China trade war is impacting his economy.
Well, China is by far our largest trading partner. The US is the second one. And of course, this tariff war between the US and China is affecting both the US, China, and the whole world. We hope that they will reach an agreement because tariff wars are not good for anybody. And you know how they start, but you never know how they finish. I remember what happened when we had the international crisis in 1929. We reacted the worst possible way by trying to protect ourselves instead of trying to expand free trade. And I think that free trade is the best way for China, for the US, for the world.
Now let's take a look at Chile's move to join China's One Belt, One Road initiative. This has sent some countries broke, though. There's a lot of concerns that this is part of China's debt diplomacy, or how it's been described by Vice President Mike Pence. So is this something that has you worried?
Yes, I think that I would like the US to come back to this area. We negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement with all the countries, especially with the US. And the US was very enthusiastic about that agreement, and with President Trump, they dropped out. I hope that that will change also, because I think that the US is leaving too much space to China, both in the Asia-Pacific area and also in Latin America.
So do you think the US is taking a step back from its role as a leader on the global stage?
Yes, and I think that that's not good for the US, it's not good for the world. But this Pacific or Asia-Pacific area is really showing to the world that free trade is possible.
And that was Chile's President Sebastián Piñera. They're speaking exclusively to the BBC. Now, the Reserve Bank of India today will hold a crucial board meeting. It will be the first time that the central bank officials, as well as government-appointed members on the board of the central bank, will come face-to-face in a feud between the central bank and the Indian government. Now, BBC India business reporter Samir Hashmi has more.
The meeting comes after the rift between the government and the Reserve Bank of India became public over regulatory issues. Among a host of matters that will be discussed during the meeting, one of the prime ones is going to be with regards to easing lending rules for Indian banks. The Reserve Bank of India, headed by Governor Urjit Patel, has put in strict measures to clean up the balance sheets of Indian banks that have piled up huge levels of bad loans. The central bank is worried that if these non-performing assets are not reduced in the near future, then that could lead to long-term risks for the Indian economy. But due to these restrictions, many banks are not able to lend. And this is having a severe impact on businesses, especially medium and small-sized firms who are not able to borrow capital. With Indian elections scheduled next year, the government is worried about economic growth slowing down due to these tight lending rules. It wants the RBI to ease these rules, but the central bank has refused to budge from its position. The government has also been exerting pressure by initiating a rule which has never been used before, which allows the government to intervene on matters of public importance. But so far, New Delhi has restrained itself from taking the next step under this power, which gives it the authority to ask the RBI to implement directions issued by it. That's why the meeting on Monday that will take place at the RBI's headquarters is crucial, as the government-appointed members on the board who form a majority will try to push some of those demands. Many news organizations have reported over the last few weeks that if the government tries to enforce its demands, then Governor Urjit Patel may even resign. But there have been signs of both sides trying to diffuse the tension and iron out the differences over the last few days ahead of this meeting. However, it's still not clear how will this crucial meeting unfold on Monday. Samir Hashmi, BBC News, Mumbai.
Now, the last few days have been dominated by the fallout from the draft Brexit agreement. Later today, ministers from the EU 27 are meeting to discuss the deal and finalise the joint political declaration on future relations between the EU and the UK. So, what are the big concerns from the draft Brexit agreement and what do they mean for Europe? Well, the draft withdrawal agreement includes a financial settlement from the UK thought to be worth about $50 billion, all part of the so-called divorce deal as the UK prepares to leave the EU. And Northern Ireland exported around $6 billion worth of goods to the EU in 2017, and concern over a harsh Irish border issue has been a major sticking point in the negotiations. And the draft agreement says the EU would work with the UK to agree a trade deal in order to avoid physical checks on goods at the border. Now, if talks fail, the so-called backstop measure would be used to keep the border open. Now, the draft agreement also gives London's financial centre only basic level access to the EU's market, similar to that really enjoyed by American and Japanese firms. Now, we've got lots more making news, of course, and business news making the headlines this morning include Japan's exports, which rose more than 8% in October from a year earlier, reversing the prior month's decline. Imports jumped almost 20% during the same period. The trade balance came to a deficit of almost $4 billion. Well, let's take a look at those markets now, how they're reacting to all of that. Some of those trade numbers actually helping lift sentiment there in Japan. You're seeing the Nikkei is higher, also taking their cues from Wall Street, but really higher because of some reduced issues, reduced tensions around the US-China trade spat. But we know, of course, there's lots of other things concerning the markets, including Brexit, which I just talked about, the Italian politics as well. So we're seeing the All Ordinaries in Australia currently lower, and of course waiting for the Hang Seng as well to open. And of course the US expecting a holiday shortened week. It will be Thanksgiving later this week. And that's it for the programme. Thanks for watching.
You're watching BBC News. Our main stories this hour. President Trump has said that he has been briefed about an audio tape of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but has said that he has not listened to it himself because it was so violent. Emergency workers in California are still struggling to contain wildfires that have devastated parts of the state. At least 76 people have died and over 1,200 are still missing. The former Welsh Rugby and Lions captain Gareth Thomas has been the victim of a homophobic hate crime in Cardiff. The 44-year-old, who in 2009 became the first professional rugby union player to announce publicly that he's gay, appeared bruised in a video posted on social media. Stefan Messenger reports.
On and off the rugby pitch, Gareth Thomas has a record to be proud of. The first Welshman to win 100 caps for his country, he played for and captained the British Lions too. In 2009, he made history by becoming the first professional rugby union player to announce publicly that he's gay. Speaking to the BBC at the time, he urged an end to homophobia in sport.
In the future, there could be somebody out there who's 18 and found out at the age of 16 he was gay, so he put his boots in the cupboard. Maybe, you know, and if all my message is clear and right, then maybe this kid will go back to his boots, dust them off, put his boots back on and go out there and play rugby.
But on a night out in Cardiff yesterday, the rugby star turned role model was assaulted. Bruised and visibly shaken, he took to social media to describe what had happened.
I was the victim in my home city of a hate crime for my sexuality. Why I wanted to be positive, because I want to say thank you to the police who were involved and were very helpful and allowed me to do restorative justice with the people who did this, because I thought they could learn more that way than any other way. And also to the people of Cardiff who supported me and helped me, because there's a lot of people out there who want to hurt us, but unfortunately for them, there's a lot more that want to help us heal.
Messages of support have since been flooding in for him online. Love that you concentrate on the positives, said former Wales goalkeeper Neville Southall. Keep being a role model. Top guy.
South Wales Police confirmed that a 16-year-old boy had been dealt with by way of restorative justice following the incident on Saturday night. We're told the teenager admitted assault and has apologised to Gareth Thomas. Stefan Messenger, BBC News, Cardiff.
Some of Britain's biggest companies are urging the government to honour a promise to give mental health in the workplace the same status as physical health. Executives from 50 companies, including Royal Mail, WH Smith and Ford, have written to Theresa May asking her to follow through on last year's manifesto pledge to update health and safety legislation. The government says it will bring forward the recommendations of an independent review panel. Lots more, as always, on our website. Regid will be here with a full bulletin of news at the top of the hour. I'm on social media. You can get in touch with me and some of the team at BBC Cash and Madeira. But now it's time for all the sports news in Sport Today.